Welcome everybody to today's lecture. Thank you for coming. My name is Mike Pitstick and I'm Associate Director of Annual Giving here at UD, as well as a double alumnus, and I'm happy to be with you today. EnCore is a lecture series conducted by the faculty of the University of Dallas in conjunction with the Office of Alumni Relations. The lectures are offered to alumni and friends and reframe topics from the core curriculum in fresh perspectives. Today's lecture is co-hosted by Liberal Learning for Life's Studies in Catholic Faith and Culture program, which facilitates intellectual formation in the Catholic liberal arts tradition by offering video-based courses co-taught by UD professors. Videos like the one we'll watch together today are currently available for free. See the chat for links and more information. Today, we're joined by Dr. Jonathan J. Sanford, the 10th president of the University of Dallas and professor of philosophy. Dr. Sanford began his tenure as UD's president last week, but he has been with UD since 2015, first as dean of Constantine College, then as provost beginning in 2018. His video presentation is entitled History, Tradition, and Hope from Studies in Catholic Faith and Culture's video series, The Person, History, and Tradition. Please note that the video was filmed prior to Dr. Sanford's elevation to the presidency. In addition to the video, there is a handout for this lecture as well, which you can find in the chat. After the video, Dr. Michael West, Affiliate Assistant Professor of English and Outreach Director in the Liberal Learning for Life program here at UD, as well as a UD alumnus, will discuss the video with Dr. Sanford. When they open up the discussion to all of you, please use the chat to ask any questions that you may have, and we'll either read your question or call on you. Please stay muted unless I call on you to speak, but you are invited to turn on your video. If you have any technical problems or questions during the video or the discussion, please message Alumni Relations for assistance. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the video.
So welcome back. You made it. We're here on the last class of our 10 in the Human Person, History and Tradition, Course 2 in Studies in Catholic Faith and Culture. I hope you found it nourishing. I hope you found it refreshing. I hope that we planted some seeds of things that you might want to explore further and ideas and discussions you might want to keep having, because that would be wonderful. Today we have to talk to you Dr. Jonathan Sanford, the Provost of the University of Dallas. Now, the Provost is the Chief Academic Officer of the university. He's the Dean above the Deans. He sets the academic vision for the entire university, and he is the one who conceived of the entire Studies in Catholic Faith and Culture program. He wanted this to be liberal learning made accessible, and I hope we've achieved some of that. I hope we've brought you some liberal learning, and I hope we've made it accessible to you over the course of Course 2. Dr. Sanford is here to talk to you as a way to sum up the entire course about hope and history. How do we find hope in our history? How do we find hope in this entire panoply of the Catholic Church and its past? How do we look at its present? And how do we look forward to its future? Here's Dr. Sanford to talk about hope and history.
What do you hope for? Well, we often say we hope for health for our family, health for our children. We do hope for material well-being. We do hope for a life in which we're relatively free from extraordinary stress, although we recognize that oftentimes life is going to have quite a bit of suffering, right? But we do hope for those things. In fact, we pray for those things. And one question I want to begin with is, do you really hope for those things? Or do you long for those things? Longing in the sense of wanting those things. And I do think you can genuinely hope for those things, right? The goods which I've articulated really are goods, right? Health, well-being of your children. You want to educate your children well. You want to see them stay firm in their faith. You want to have a relatively stable family life, which requires some financial stability, and so on, right? I think you can hope for those things and not just long for them. Okay, by saying not just long for them, what do I mean? What am I indicating there? Well, longing doesn't necessarily indicate that the good that you are wanting is a difficult good, right? That's one difference. And it doesn't necessarily imply that you're willing to work for that difficult good. There might be all kinds of things that I want or long for, but that doesn't mean I'm really willing to work for them. This is the virtue of hope in a kind of ordinary sense. The world being what it is, this temporal order being what it is, you recognize that you may fail in achieving those goods, right? And you may fail through no fault of your own. The economy could collapse and you'll be left without a job. You might be the world's best father or mother, and yet your son or daughter might choose to abandon their faith. You might do everything you can to care for the physical well-being of your child, and yet they come down with a terminal disease. So what we learn from these interactions with the temporal order, a world that's fraught with uncertainty, is that we will be disappointed. And yet we know we shouldn't lose hope, and yet again, we will be disappointed. So things that are physical, things that are temporal, they will eventually let you down. Ought one then to abandon all hope, all faith that those goods are realizable? Well, I want to suggest that that's the wrong question. In fact, I want to suggest that part of the difficulty that many people experience in their lives is in not realizing that that's the wrong question. One of the glories of our faith is that it elevates our gaze to a good that surpasses our nature, right? So one problem, or one way to think about the problem of hoping for those goods that I was just looking at in a way in which you invest your very sense of well-being and happiness in them, is that you have set your sights too low, right? Our faith elevates our gaze to eternity, right? Our faith makes us first long for a good that surpasses our nature, the good of friendship with God, right? That's one way to understand what we mean by heaven. It's ultimately a deep, intimate friendship with our Lord. And our faith allows us to yearn for that, and not just yearn for it and long for it, but to hope for it, right? And when that is recognized as a possibility, it situates the other goods that we hope for, right? So indeed, if you hope for heaven and you hope for this eternal friendship with our Lord, when you are disappointed in the temporal order, when your children do get sick, when you do lose your job, when you yourself become enfeebled and are facing your death, one does not need to lose his or her good cheer, because your hope is invested in eternity. Your hope is, in fact, grounded in faith. So St. Paul, I want to talk a little bit now about the relationship between faith and hope. St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, reflects at length on how faith is a gift of, you might say, intellectual certainty. Right? We see with the eyes of faith. We recognize truths in ways that exceed our natural reason. And hope provides us with the endurance to pursue those goods. And this is a theme that Pope Benedict XVI picks up at great length and depth in Spe Salve, his great encyclical on the hope of salvation, in which he recognizes that the orientation towards Christ our Lord is an orientation that transforms our entire way of life. So I want to reflect now on history and come to the question of what should we hope for from history or in history. But I want to introduce some distinctions in order to do that, right? First, let's spend some time thinking about history as a science, history as a discipline, right? The thing that you study when you take a graduate or an undergraduate course in history, right? That's one sense of history. The second sense of history is one that might be unfamiliar to you in these terms, but is an idea that I think will resonate, and that is thinking of the human being as a being with a history who understands himself and others through history. So the human being as a historically narrating animal. That's the second sense of history. And then a third sense of history is the view of history as having a kind of end or goal. And this is the grand sweeping view of history, whether we're talking about salvation history on the one hand or a progressive view of history terminating in a kind of eternal human worldly peace or satiation or what have you, right? That third sense of history is one that you spent some time reflecting on already throughout this second course in the series, and I want to return to it and frame a question at the end. History is the study of events, of principles, of things that have happened from which we hope to extract life lessons and move forward. We correct our gaze. We learn to see as we ought, as Dr. Atto shows us with respect to Christopher Dawson's way of thinking about history. So the second sense of history is this view of the human being as a historically narrating animal. Right? This is an understanding that we are beings with a history on the one hand, but more significantly, we are beings who make sense of our lives and the lives of others through the stories we tell. So think of Moses, for instance, who is the author of the first part of the Bible, right? He tells the story of the Jews and their extraction from the Egyptians, the formation of a new people, and he gives the law in narrative form. Think of the stories you tell your children. Think of the stories your mother and your father told you. We make sense of our lives through the stories that we tell. If I were to look out my window and see a man digging in his front lawn, I wouldn't know very much. I could see that he's digging, right? But I don't know if he's preparing his garden. I don't know if he is engaging in exercise in order to please his wife. I don't know why he's digging in his garden, right? What I need is a historical account that speaks to the intentions behind his action, right? That's what narrative provides. And I want to suggest that we can't make sense of our own intentions or anyone else's intentions without story, without a narrative, right? And so this second sense of history is bound up in a very important manner with regard to how we understand the nature of the human person. We are, by nature, storytelling animals, which means that we can't make sense of ourselves or anyone else, which is, at its essence, a matter of understanding our intentions and others' intentions, because it's there that one finds the nexus of what you think is right and the action of the will in moving forward without stories. Right? The third sense of history is that of the grand sweeping narrative, you might say, right? Where we see a movement from the beginning of time to this privileged moment. If you're a progressive, for instance, you think that each generation has gotten better and better. We're more and more technologically advanced, and so we don't need to really care about what came before. That's the attitude that some people have, which ironically articulates a historical perspective, but encourages us not to go study history. Contrast that with salvation history, this view of the encounter of God with man, with Abraham encountering God, Moses encountering God, up through the other prophets, the moment of God entering human history through the incarnation up to this present day. But the perspective of believers is just the opposite. We are encouraged to go back and to study each moment of that history, to make sense of where we are now because of the past that informs us. We have now this clash within this third view of history, the grand sweeping view of history, between salvation history on the one hand and a view of progressive history on the other. And I think one challenge that Christians face is, what ought my disposition be towards this temporal order? Right? If my ultimate destination is heaven, and I see my hope resting in heaven, should I have any hope in restoring justice within this temporal order? Should I invest my time in striving to make things better? Especially if I take the words of our Lord at their literal level in some of the passages in Matthew's gospel and certainly in the book of Revelation, where we recognize that all things are passing away. This world is coming to an end. And if I'm meant for heaven, why should I spend any time shoring up this temporal order? Why should I invest myself? Why don't I just create a separate culture, altogether distinct from the culture that surrounds me? Why ought I to yearn to bring others into this way of seeing? Well, one short answer to that is we recognize that the fundamental task of any Christian is to be engaged in evangelization. Right? We are a missionary religion. But there are also goods to truly seek. In addition to that, I would add, there are goods to truly seek within this temporal order. And I want to leave you with a reflection on two virtues that I think are compatible in ways that we don't always appreciate, right? So, ought we to hope for wealth? Ought we to hope for health? Ought we to hope for a stable society? Ought we to hope for these temporal goods? Yes. Ought we to strive for them with great effort? Yes. That's a matter of the virtue of magnanimity, a greatness of soul or a kind of great-heartedness. St. Thomas Aquinas argues that this virtue of striving to do great things and even accepting praise for those good things you do within the temporal order is fully compatible with humility. In fact, he goes so far as to suggest that humility, genuine humility, is dependent upon magnanimity, and magnanimity is dependent upon humility. Right? So rather than thinking of these two in conflict, he sees them together. Right? What is humility? Humility is the virtue that allows us to recognize that every good gift we have comes from the Lord. Right? So we acknowledge our givenness, we acknowledge our giftedness as fruits from God. And we would fail to exercise that virtue well, that acknowledgement that everything we have comes from God. And so we are receivers of gifts from God if we did not strive to use those gifts to their best opportunities, right? We fail to be truly humble if we fail to strive to do great things. And we will fail to do great things if we fail to recognize that the gifts that we have are gifts from our Heavenly Father. And so rather than giving up as part of a response to this clash between a corrupt view of history and progress versus the correct view of salvation history, right? The response is not, okay, let's give up on all of this over here, right? True, I think progress is a misguided notion, but we don't give up on the world. We strive to transform the world. We strive to build up culture. We strive to do so with all humility, but it's still a striving for greatness. And that striving for greatness is an opportunity for us to take our participation already, our anticipatory participation in the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God here, and to share it with others.
So what did you think of Dr. Sanford's distinction between hope and longing? What did you think of the way he tried to address hope in history? How is it that we can live in our biblical 70, the 70 years that the Psalms say is a man's lifespan, and yet not feel constrained by that, not feel trapped by that, not feel the limitedness of that? Maybe you've begun to think about the education you want for your children and the kind of things that you want to hand on to them, the kinds of things that will make them strong, that will make them able to withstand the buffets and chaos of the contemporary world and live in a world where they might deal with suffering, where they will deal with suffering, where they will deal with death, and maybe even go to their own death with a laugh and a joke, and come back again to that notion that so much of what we know, so much of what we understand to be true, comes from our trusting in the authority of others. And that also is a part of tradition, that we have these traditions, we have these people from the past, whether it's Thomas Aquinas or Anselm of Beck or Thomas More or Hildegard of Bingen, who have handed on to us a rich treasure. But ultimately, of course, it's back to those four men that I keep talking about, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Do we have the humility to trust in them? Do we have the sense that they have the authority, that they are telling us the truth, so that we can leap off backwards and rappel down and feel free in our faith? We must never forget that we are homo viator, man on the way, man the wayfarer. But we're not on our way to any temporal destination. It's not even a pilgrimage to Canterbury or Rome or the Jerusalem that's in Palestine, but to the celestial Jerusalem, to that end of time where we will get to the end of our wayfaring and, like Dante at the end of the Divine Comedy, gaze upon the face of Christ himself.
I hope that the video gave you all something to think about heading into our discussion. I'll now go ahead and turn it over to Dr. West. As I mentioned before, especially given our relatively large group, please ask any questions you may have in the chat, and we will either read your question or call on you.
Thanks, Mike. Dr. Sanford, there's so many rich concepts that you introduced in this presentation. So we have more than enough to work from. But my first question was just, I wanted to ask you to clarify your opening distinction between hope and longing. And my question is it possible to long for and to hope for the same things? That is the difference between the two simply my orientation toward them? Or is it the case that some objects are simply impossible to be hoped for? Oh, sorry, we need your audio, Dr. Sanford.
All right. That is a rookie mistake. I've been using Zoom for a steady year now. So thanks for that opening question. And thanks to all of our guests for being part of this conversation. That video is part of a series that has as a particular audience those who are interested in learning about the Catholic faith and culture. And the context, I think, is important for understanding the way some of the distinctions arise there. So the way I think about longing and hope, hope has to endure in the face of hardship. The good needs to be realizable with respect to hope. Longing, I think of as having two dimensions to it, right? So if I were to long to have wings and fly like a bird, right? That's clearly an unrealizable good. So that would certainly be one problem. But let's say that I'm hopelessly addicted to cigarettes and I long to be free of them. Well, I don't really have hope that I'll be free from them. I'd love to not be a smoker of cigarettes, but I'm not really willing to see that as a realizable good, even though it is, right? And so what I'm lacking is the kind of conviction that is necessary in order to overcome the obstacles in pursuit of that good. And so I think those are two different senses of longing, both of which are not the same thing as hope. And there's a difference between hope as it's described in a strictly philosophical context, and then the theological virtue of hope, right? And part of what I was trying to bring out in that video is the wonder of hoping for something that's beyond our nature, right? So when we talk about this virtue as a theological virtue, what does that entail? What it entails the reflection upon a good that is by our natural disposition impossible to hope for, but now invested with this grace, this infusion of what we call a theological virtue. I can see that as in fact a goal, and I'm willing to move towards it. I'm willing to respond to those opportunities, those invitations to make progress towards it.
Thank you. Your discussion about the question of progress and the question of salvation history really brought to mind, to me, a phrase that I've heard a lot lately. But I wanted to ask you what you think about it and how you understand it. It's from Martin Luther King, who's using a very different set of terms, but there's a famous line he has where he says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." So, in the light of what you've given us here, how do you understand King's statement? What's right about it? What needs to be enhanced? How would you say the truth that maybe he's getting at in your own words, or in a way that works with the terms you've laid out for us today?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So I would say the most unsubtle part of the presentation we all just watched is the way that I talk about progress there. And I'm trying to bring up about a very stark distinction between two views of what I was calling a sweeping view of history, and put them in conflict. And many subtleties are lost there, and I think need to be recovered. So for a more in-depth reflection. What I was trying to characterize was the view that there might be some sort of utopia that's achievable. So whether we're talking about a view coming out of the Hegelian strain of thinking about history, or even the view that Francis Fukuyama made popular a couple of decades ago, where we're at the end of history, we've kind of achieved this high water mark of the satisfaction of our appetites. That's also meant by him, of course, as a critique, right? Because he's identifying the loss of thumos, of that spiritedness that's been an important part of human history. So that view of everything working out for the best eventually, I had in mind, and also that view that has attached to it the negative claim that we ought not to return to our ancient sources, whether biblical or Greek or what have you, right? Because we're just done with those sorts of things. We've made it beyond that, and this view of progress is sometimes attached not to genuine science, but a certain scientism where each generation makes additional advances, and we move beyond the next level. We don't need to go back. We don't have to have recourse to the past. And what's lost there? Well, a deeper appreciation of the heroic in the human person, a deeper understanding of what it means to encounter God, and to wrestle. I've been reading recently Leon Kass's commentary on the book of Genesis, right, where he goes through in great detail a sophisticated, philosophically sapiential reflection upon the book of Genesis, and what we would miss if we thought, well, we just need our principles, we just need the things that have been handed over to us in a kind of easy information transfer way in our contemporary culture. If
If we had that attitude, because we've just made progress over everything else that's preceded us, we would not uncover the depths of the human soul in ways that are necessary in order to make sense of our moment right now. So those sorts of ideas attached to um, this view of progress that I was speaking of in a very lump sum sort of way, pulling together a number of negatives is what I meant to describe. Um, and and yet there are real moments of progress that I think we should recognize and celebrate, that um, Martin Luther King identifies. We ought to be striving for justice, and we have made progress. So if you consider the condition of most of humanity during the time of the Roman Empire, right? Living conditions are significantly advanced. We have far greater participation in political processes than have our ancient forebears. And I think we have a much deeper respect for the dignity and equality of each human being than we had in the past, right? And those deeper insights are necessary to advance the notion of justice. Justice understood as that which promotes the common good, right? That being said, there are reasons, if one put his or her stock in the current moment and thought that we're getting closer and closer to a point of total justice and complete unification, right? The events of this past year would be profoundly disappointing, right? And disillusioning. And I think many people are feeling profoundly disillusioned. And because what we thought we had achieved in certain areas, for instance, in areas that touch upon racial solidarity and justice and a healthy political climate and recognition of elements of our democratic process, and one could name other things besides. There's been so much upheaval that indeed one might think, well, instead of progress, we've just regressed and we've lost something. What I was trying to aim at with that contrast is that from a position of faith, one ought not to lose one's hope, or one's, not just one's hope in an eternal destination, but one's hope in shoring up justice and other civic virtues in our contemporary day and age. So one thing I'm particularly concerned about is the denigration of civil discourse, the way in which many people seem not to engage in disagreements from a rational point of view. We seem to regress in our ability to hear each other and to exercise those virtues of listening and articulating the position of an opponent and really engaging in debate that's fruitful and progressive in another sense of progress, right? Where we're moving towards hopefully some shared understanding, even if we end up disagreeing on the particular outcome of such a debate, right? So should we say, well, it's a lost cause? Certainly not, right? So the fundamental work of educating students that we engage in here at the University of Dallas is precisely an expression of deep hope in our culture, deep hope in the human spirit, and deep hope in what we can achieve through engaging in a fruitful and rich educational experience.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you to expand on one of your points that you made there, that to make sense of ourselves. So in your presentation, you said that to make sense of ourselves or another person requires that we understand the story of which they are a part. And it's only through that story that we can understand intentions. Now, your example in the presentation was a very simple one to help us grasp the concept, right? A man digging in the yard. But it sounds like, based on the things you were just saying, that that question of understanding something by means of story also applies, it seems to me, through to larger institutions such as families, universities, communities, cities, nation states, churches, and so on. Is that accurate to say that it's the same process? We still have to come to terms with what the story is, of which actions collectively are a part.
That's exactly right. So whether we're talking about our very selves, so one for those of you who don't see it in the background, Alistair McIntyre is very much informing this way that I'm talking about narrative, and I've done a lot of work on his thought and a lot of teaching on his works, and so one thing that strikes me when I'm thinking through metaphysical questions, let's say, teaching a course on the philosophy of being, and one is striving to think about the timeless truths, right? Is how much of our very lives are, as it were, um, irrelevant to those timeless truths. Right? They're accidental. Our lives are our parents didn't need to meet each other. We didn't need to be born at a particular time. We're all from a particular place. Particularity is in fact the mark of human existence. And what we strive to do when we first start making friends, even as children, is to make sense of each other through telling each other. I'm thinking of the stories I hear from my own kids. Oh, so and so's dad does this. So and so's mother used to play basketball in college, and these stories frame the picture that we have of others. Certainly frame the pictures we have of ourselves.
Hello.
Such stories also are the sort of things that institutions need to not just, you can't really have them say them about themselves, but institutions don't make sense without their histories. Our American culture doesn't make sense without its history, right? Our faith, I would argue, doesn't make sense without its history. So in talking about those three different senses of history in the lecture, I did not mean to suggest that they're separate from each other, right? So the science of history, the discipline of history, considers both that second sense of the human being as a storytelling animal and what that entails, and the discipline of history considers elements of at least raises the question whether there's some ultimate order to history, some telos, some goal that history is oriented towards, and both, whether you've got a Feuerbachian or Hegelian or a Marxist view of history on the one hand, or a Jewish or a Christian view of history on the other, you've got some sense of a goal, but the science of history would help us to make sense of that within the middle ground where human beings live as storytelling animals. We are situating our own personal narratives within the context of our institutions, within the context of our polity, within the context of the view of history from a grand perspective that we are most imbued with.
Thank you. We have a few questions coming in the chat. I'm going to ask one more question of Dr. Sanford, and then we're going to move to some of the comments and questions in the chat. So I encourage the rest of you to start thinking and typing something in over the next few minutes. It strikes me, Dr. Sanford, that your example of Leon Kass reading Genesis was a really interesting one, because it seems to me that the relationship of the Jewish people to their own history seems like a very interesting case here. On the one hand, the story of the Jewish people is a story of returning to sources, but the law of Moses and even the parts of the Torah that are non-legal, let's say. At the same time, it is a history. It is a narrative about a people. Mm-hmm. And the narrative is anything but a whitewashed noble lie kind of story in which everything turns out great. And that's the story
That's right.
that the Jewish people tell to themselves, and this is the story that Christians inherit. I mean, what is that? Is that a model for telling a story and for relating to history in a way that is both? It does not lack reverence, and it does not flinch from speaking the truth about sin. Does that seem right to you, or how would you add to that?
I think that that's absolutely right. It's one should not think that we deceive ourselves when we tell stories in which we are always seen in the right light, right? I mean, when I think um, the stories, particularly of Genesis and Exodus, are stories that reveal truths about the human being. I think the narrative of the garden and the falling away to temptation and expulsion from the garden. This is to articulate a truth about our very selves, right? So we encounter facets of our own personal being through the recovery and the meditation upon these stories. But there are heroes, right? The arc of the Joseph story in Genesis. I mean, truly a, a hero, and yet there's so much sin involved in that story, right? But there's reconciliation as well, right? So all the elements of all of the great stories, I would say, can be found there in the Torah, and this is why we are all encouraged again and again to return to these stories, and that's on the grand level, but certainly within the the stories we tell ourselves at the end of the day when we reflect upon what we said, what we failed to say, what our intentions were, right? If we whitewash those, then we'll go to bed none the wiser. But if we're honest storytellers in our daily reflections, then indeed we'll make progress of the sort that really is attainable, which is progress in becoming better human beings and better contributors to a culture of justice.
Thank you. I want to turn to some of the questions and comments in the chat. So James Doyle asked you a question, and then we already have a comment on the question, so I wanted to give you both and then invite you to respond. So James Doyle asked a very straightforward question. How do you respond to people who claim that the end goal of, say, a human life is personal pleasure and not heaven? And one of our commenters, Israel Simcha Norman, suggests one way out is to distinguish between levels of pleasure, and the highest of which is the pleasure of a relationship with God.
Mhm.
And if you assume such an approach, he suggests, then no particular question gets sublimated. How do you think about that question of the relationship between pleasure and heaven in relationship to God, and whether maybe distinguishing among levels of pleasure is a way out or not?
Yeah, so I thank you for the question, and thank you for the interesting commentary, and I can see the advantage of that. I'm going to reveal myself as in some fundamental way an Aristotelian here, and I'm thinking particularly of Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. There are two accounts of pleasure really there, but the one that I find to be most rich is the one that recognizes that no good activity is without its pleasure, right? Pleasure, as Ross's translation puts it, supervenes on the good activity. Now, pleasure also supervenes on some not so good activities, right? So, with regard to the motivation for pleasure, I do think that one of the ways in which we trick ourselves or deceive ourselves is when we aim for the pleasure. We want to realize the pleasure and not the activity. However, knowing that activities have pleasure connected to them is motivating and ought to be motivating. So we ought to want to sit down to a good meal, and so much better if we sit down to a good meal with friends and engage in discourse over that meal. We can be attracted to the pleasure of that, but we need to keep our intention honed, especially on the sitting down to the meal and the conversation with our friends, right? So we're filling our bodies, we're filling our hearts and our minds through conversation, and it's pleasurable. So pleasure, Aristotle argues, increases in its attachment to good activities, the better we are at performing those good activities. So we take pleasure in exercising temperance, right? He even argues that we take pleasure when we die courageously. There's a supervening pleasure in that act. So I think yearning for heaven, we can only make sense of that idea through the ways in which we make sense of other kinds of goods and how we think about pleasures there. And there is a pleasure attached, right? We often call this pleasure delight or joy, to the ideas that we have of what it would be to engage in seeing God face to face. What exactly that would entail, we can't really say. But if it's like the pleasure of looking into your friend's face and engaging in a rich conversation in which you are revealing elements of yourselves to each other, we can make sense of that, right? So we I think can appropriately long for the joy of heaven, but we will miss our mark, so to speak, in our efforts in pursuit of that goal if our primary intention is not focused on relationship with that heavenly being. Just as it would be the case if your friend would feel slighted, I think, if you told him or her that you really only wanted to spend time with them for the pleasure of it, and it didn't really have a whole lot to do with him or her, right? So I think it's similar in terms of how we think about heaven.
Thank you. I wanted to give you a question I received, which also focuses on the particularities of a situation. So I'm just gonna read the question verbatim. The questioner asks, I recently had a student in a liberal arts class who said, quote, "The story of my life got messed up last year." When I mentioned Alistair McIntyre's narrative of life idea to them, what would you say to that student who we think was alluding to COVID?
Boy, there are like three different things there.
So this is Dr. Sanford, counselor, life advice giver, and philosopher.
Yeah,
But,
boy.
yeah. So
it's a good question, right? So we can think. I'm wondering on what level. So I'm coming at this more. I'm going to come at this more from a practical level, and if one thought that one's life ought to be just like certain views of history, where each year is better than the next, and I think students sometimes have this perspective that they're going to go to college and they're going to get more and more knowledge, whatever that is, right? And they often think of knowledge as though it's like you're downloading something from the internet and you're going to fill up the tank even more, and then you're going to go have great adventures and live this life, right? So real suffering and hardship disrupts that narrative, to be sure, right? It's not what we anticipated in our future. And what is our from an earthly point of view? I mean, we're ultimately preparing for death, right? Here's where Socrates, I think, is a good person to call in mind. And I was reading this past summer Marcus Aurelius, and in part to think about how to think about hardship and steadying ourselves for what we can actually control, because so much has been beyond our control. Well, the real goal of your life hasn't changed because of COVID, right? So if you thought that the path ought to be relatively easy and you keep making progress, or have some hardships along the way, but you didn't anticipate this thing, right? So the story of your life, it has been altered by this, without a doubt. Um, but what we ultimately seek are the same things, whether we're faced with this set of hardships or that set of hardships, right? We're seeking wisdom. We're thinking, we're striving for a cultivation of a deeper embrace of the virtues, so that we can indeed be involved in the lives of others. I mean, ultimately, life is oriented towards relationship with other people, and the cultivation of friendship. And I take that to be the case not only when we're thinking about heaven, but within this temporal order, right? Another way in which I'm an Aristotelian. So that student, oftentimes we talk about, well, there are opportunities to be perceived in the midst of these hardships. Let's take advantage of those opportunities. I don't think that quite gets deep enough, right? What I would I guess begin to do if I was in conversation with this student is to ask him or her, well, what do you think life is all about? What are you really aiming at? And how can this experience of living in the midst of COVID um, be seen as an obstacle that can be overcome through having good hope and building friendships? And I think friendship is on my mind a lot because people have become so isolated under COVID, and it has been so difficult to cultivate relationships, and we yearn for those relationships. So um, I think there are ways in which our re-embrace of friendships, our deepening encounter with other human beings who are similarly in pursuit of wisdom, truth, and virtue, will be enriched because of the struggles that we've had under COVID. We'll more deeply appreciate the opportunities that we have to build relationships, and do so with more focus and dedication, right? That's possible. One has to make it possible through acting upon those kinds of convictions. And so that's where the invitation to articulate on the part of that student, what did you think life was all about? What do you think your story is really supposed to be about? And see if you can't uncover some deeper motivations.
Thank you, Dr. Sanford. And to take us out, I'm going to hand it back to Mike Pitstick.
Thank you, Dr. West, and a big thanks to Dr. Sanford for taking the time to join us today. If any of you have feedback related to today's discussion or suggestions for future virtual events you would like to see, please email us at udalum@udallas.edu.